It was a Tuesday, 9 minutes before the dinner rush, when Darlene Webb did the thing that would change everything. She was 53 years old, had owned the Sun-Up Diner on Route 12 for 11 years, and had learned long ago that kindness does not announce itself. It shows up in small moments, in the space between one thought and the next, and if you are not paying attention, you miss it. She had not missed it in 11 years. She was not about to start. The Sun-Up had been a failing breakfast spot called the Route 12 Cafe when Darlene and her husband Walter bought it for $48,000 and a prayer. It had 3 booths, a cracked linoleum floor the colour of old mustard, and a kitchen that Ray, the cook they inherited along with the deed, described charitably as needing attention. Walter had spent the first 3 weekends replacing the floor himself, tile by tile, while Darlene repainted the walls and ordered new menus and renamed the place after the thing she loved most about that stretch of highway, which was the way the sun came up over the tree line to the east and poured straight through the front windows every morning like it was glad to be there. Walter died of a heart attack on a Thursday afternoon 11 months ago now at the age of 56. On his way home from the hardware store with a new faucet handle for the back bathroom. She had been here at the diner, pouring coffee. She didn't find out for 2 hours. The diner had stayed open that night because she did not know what else to do with herself, and Ray had come around the counter and held her when the last customer left. This big, quiet man who had worked her kitchen for 11 years and barely said 10 words together in a given week, and he had not said anything then either. He had just put his arms around her and let her cry. She had not changed a single thing about the Sun-Up after Walter died. Some people remake their lives in grief, and some people hold very still, and Darlene was the holding still kind. The rule about service members had been Walter's rule originally, from the first week they opened. His brother had served in the Gulf. He had never talked about it much, but the rule had been absolute, and Darlene had kept it the way she kept all of Walter's best ideas, quietly and without requiring anyone to know where it came from. The young man who came through her door that afternoon looked like he had been travelling since before the sun came up. He was in uniform, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his face carrying the particular kind of tired that comes not from a long drive but from somewhere deeper and further away. He chose the stool at the far end of the counter, the one closest to the window, and he set his bag on the floor between his feet and stared at the laminated menu like he was working hard to read the words. Darlene watched him from behind the coffee station. She had a way of reading people that her late husband Walter used to call her superpower, though she preferred to call it 40 years of paying attention. What she read in this young man was hunger, and something quieter than hunger, a kind of relief at being somewhere warm and still. She picked up the coffee pot. "Just passing through?" she said. He looked up. He had steady brown eyes and a serious mouth that softened a little when she set the coffee in front of him without asking. "Headed home," he said. "Haven't been back in 14 months. She did not ask where home was from. That kind of question had its own weight. She just nodded and pulled out her order pad. "What looks good to you?" He ordered the meatloaf plate with mashed potatoes and a side of cornbread, and Darlene wrote it down and took it back to Ray in the kitchen, and she kept her eye on that stool at the far end of the counter the whole time he ate. He ate the way a person eats when they have not sat down to a real meal in a while, with full attention, and he was quiet and did not bother anyone. And when he had eaten the last of the cornbread, he reached into the front pocket of his uniform and set a folded bill on the counter. Darlene walked over and set her hand flat on the bill and pushed it back toward him. He looked up, surprised. "We don't charge service members in this place," she said. "Not ever. You put that back in your pocket." He stared at her for a moment. His expression was the expression of a person who is not accustomed to being given things. He said, "Ma'am, I can pay. I want to pay." "I know you can," she said. "That's not the point." She refilled his coffee. She brought him a slice of her apple pie, which was not on the menu because she only baked it on Tuesdays and Fridays, and it sold out before the sign ever made it to the chalkboard. He ate the pie slowly, like he was trying to memorize it. When he finally stood up and lifted his bag onto his shoulder, he thanked her twice. His name, he told her, was Corporal Marcus Webb. She did not react when he said it, only smiled and told him to drive safe. After the door swung shut behind him and the dinner rush swallowed the next 2 hours, and it was 9 o'clock and the last table had paid, and Ray had mopped the kitchen and gone home, Darlene stood alone in the quiet diner with the lights humming overhead, and she looked out through the front window at the empty parking lot, and she thought about the name he had given her. Webb. Her maiden name, her father's name. There's The name she had kept when she married Walter because she believed a woman's name was hers to keep. She thought about it all the way home. She thought about it in the bath and at the edge of her bed in the dark. She was a Webb from Claremont, 2 hours south. She had one brother, Leonard, who had a son she had not seen since the family rift 17 years ago. She did not know how old her nephew would be now. She did not let herself count. She had not spoken to Leonard in 17 years. She did not call him that night. She told herself she had no reason to call. She told herself that Webb was not an uncommon name. She went to sleep with the window cracked and the sound of the oak tree moving in the wind, and she did not sleep well at all. The next morning she unlocked the diner at 5:30 and started the coffee and did not think about it. She thought about it all day. The rift with Leonard had started over something that was complicated at the time and was not complicated anymore. It had started over their mother's house and the decisions that got made in the last months of her mother's illness and the decisions that did not get made. And there had been words spoken on both sides that neither of them had been able to take back afterward. And the weeks of not speaking had stretched into months, and the months into the years that had the particular quality of silence that becomes its own kind of habit. Darlene had moved the idea of her brother into a cabinet in herself that she did not open. She was good at that. She had learned from a woman who had been better at it than anyone she had ever known, which was perhaps part of the problem. She had thought about him at Leonard's son's wedding, which she had not been invited to and had found out about from a cousin on her father's side who had attended. She had thought about him when she lost Walter because Leonard had loved Walter and Walter had loved Leonard, and there had been a moment in the first terrible week when she had picked up the phone and held it and set it back down, and not known how to make the call across 17 years of quiet. She had thought about him on his birthday, which was February 9th. She had thought about him on her birthday, which was June 3rd, because they had always celebrated together as children, a week apart in summer, and her mother had made one cake and divided it down the middle and put different coloured candles on each half. She had not called him. She did not call him now. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the far end of her own counter, where nobody ever sat except regulars who had earned the privilege over years, and she drank it slowly and looked out the front window at Route 12 in the dark, and she told herself that the young man's name was a coincidence, and that tomorrow she would not think about it. She thought about it Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. She thought about it baking the Friday pies, which sold out before noon as they always did, and she thought about it locking up on Saturday night, and she thought about it all day Sunday in her house, where the quiet had a different texture than the quiet in the diner, more personal, more insistent. On Sunday evening she found the number in the back of an old address book she kept in the kitchen drawer. She had not updated it in 17 years. She did not know if the number still worked. She looked at it for a long time. She put the address book back in the drawer. She started the week. If you have ever found yourself on the edge of something you thought was finished, you know what that night felt like. Leave a thought in the comments about a door you thought was closed that opened again, because this story is not done yet. The following Tuesday morning, Darlene came in at 5:30 as she always did, started the coffee as she always did, and was in the back proofing the pie dough when she heard the bell above the door. She heard it once, then again, then again. She came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron, and she stopped where she stood. The diner held 14 booths and 11 stools at the counter. Every one of them was filling. Men and women in uniform, some still in their BDUs and some in their dress greens, some in civilian clothes but carrying themselves the way military people carry themselves, even out of uniform, upright and spare, with a quality of alertness that never quite turns off. They had come in cars and trucks and one brown pickup with a broken taillight, and they were laughing low and talking easy, and they were filling every seat. At the near end of the counter, on the stool closest to the door, sat Corporal Marcus Webb. He looked different. He had slept. His face had some warmth in it that had not been there 7 days ago. He was smiling at Darlene with an expression that was partly sheepish and partly proud. "I told my unit," he said, "about the pie mostly, but also about everything else." Darlene looked out over her diner, at all those faces turned toward her, warm and waiting, and something moved through her that she did not have a word for right away. It felt like gratitude, but it also felt like being seen, which is not always the same thing. She cleared her throat. She picked up a coffee pot. She got to work. It took her and her one Tuesday waitress, Cynthia, the better part of an hour to get everyone fed, and Ray had to call his nephew in early to help in the kitchen, and Darlene went through 3 pies and had to start a 4th from scratch, and the noise in the room was the good noise of people who are glad to be somewhere. Several of the soldiers asked about the no-charge policy, and Darlene said it wasn't complicated, she just had rules, and they said yes ma'am, and some of them left tip money on the tables anyway, carefully, like they knew she might try to give it back. She moved through the room the way she always moved, counter to booth to kitchen and back, and she noticed things the way she always noticed things. The young woman by the window who ate her eggs without looking up, concentrating like eating was a task she was doing competently on purpose. The 2 men in the 3rd booth who were arguing in low voices about something with the comfortable heat of people who have argued about this particular thing many times before and find it entertaining. The tall man near the back who was on the phone for most of the meal, talking quietly, nodding, and who had a child's drawing folded in the chest pocket of his jacket, visible when he leaned forward to refill his own coffee from the carafe Darlene had left on the table. She topped off the coffee of a woman in her late 40s who had the kind of posture that comes from years of being in charge of things, and the woman looked up at her and said, "Marcus told us you lost your husband recently. I'm sorry." Darlene said thank you. She meant it. "He said this was his kind of place," the woman added. "He has good instincts." Cynthia came around the end of the counter with a stack of plates, and Darlene moved to help her distribute them, and for a little while she was too busy to think, which was its own kind of gift. She had been the owner of this diner for 11 years, and she had never had it full like this on a Tuesday at 8 in the morning, and she had never heard it this loud with good noise, and there was something about it that felt like the room itself was breathing differently, like a house with all the windows open. Marcus stayed until the rush thinned. He sat at his stool with his 2nd cup of coffee and watched Darlene move through the room the way she always moved, efficient and unhurried, not missing anything. When the last of his unit had paid their tips and shaken Darlene's hand and filed out, he was still sitting there. Darlene came around the counter and sat on the stool next to him. "I want to ask you something," she said, and her voice was careful in the way voices are when they are carrying something heavy. He nodded. "What's your daddy's name?" He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, something careful and a little guarded. "Leonard," he said. "Leonard Webb out of Claremont." The room was quiet. Cynthia had gone to refill the napkin dispensers, and Ray's nephew was running a mop in the kitchen, and the diner was as close to empty and still as it ever got at 9 in the morning. Darlene folded her hands in her lap. She said, "My name was Darlene Webb before I married. My brother's name is Leonard." Marcus went very still. She watched his face do the work of taking that in. She watched him cross a distance in his mind, a long distance, 17 years of it, and come out somewhere new. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the coffee sat cooling in his cup, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "He talks about you. He's talked about you my whole life." Something broke in Darlene's chest, just a small, clean break, the way a bone cracks along its weakest line. She had not expected that. She'd prepared herself for the possibility that Leonard had told his son nothing. That 17 years of silence had been 17 years of erasure. She had not prepared herself for the other thing. She pressed her hand to her mouth. She breathed. "He does," she said. "He has a picture," Marcus said. "Both of you at some birthday. You're maybe 16. He keeps it in his wallet. It's pretty beat up." Darlene made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. She reached for a napkin from the dispenser on the counter and held it, and did not use it yet. "We had a fight," she said, 17 years ago, about nothing that matters anymore." "I know," Marcus said. "He knows it too." She looked at him. He was 31 years old. He had been 14 the last time she would have seen him if the world had gone differently. He had gone and served his country and come home to a diner on Route 12, where a woman he did not know had refused to take his money, and he had not known she was his aunt, and she had not known he was her nephew, and the kindness had just been kindness. Plain and unremarkable, the kind that does not know its own weight. She thought about that. About what it means when a thing you do for no reason at all turns out to be the reason for everything. There is a kind of accounting this world keeps that has nothing to do with ledgers. It runs on older numbers. Darlene had learned that over 11 years of owning a diner where she fed people because they were hungry and because it was right and she had not kept a tally of any of it. She had not needed to. She called Leonard that afternoon, from her office in the back of the diner with the door closed. She sat in her chair with her hands in her lap, and she dialed the number Marcus gave her, and it rang twice. And then her brother answered. His voice was the same. Older, but the same underneath it, the same low register she had known since she was a girl. She had not heard it in 17 years. It landed in her chest like a hand laid flat on something sore. Lena, he said. And that was the name he had called her when they were small, the name nobody else used, the name she had forgotten she even missed until it was in the room again. Leo, she said. There was a silence, and in the silence were 17 years, a full life's worth of unsaid things, and then both of them started talking at the same time, and stopped and started again, and Darlene laughed and Leonard laughed, and it was not graceful and it was not simple, but it was real. She told him about the diner first because it was the easiest place to start, the most neutral ground, and she could hear him listening the way people listen when they are trying to picture something. She told him about Walter buying the place and fixing the floor on his hands and knees. She told him about the rule. There was a long pause after that, and when Leonard spoke again, his voice was different, thicker. Marcus told me about it, he said. About the meatloaf and the pie. He called me from the parking lot. From your parking lot? No, Leonard said. From your parking lot. Right after it happened. He called me from the parking lot of your diner before he even drove away. Darlene sat with that for a moment. The idea of her nephew sitting in his truck in her parking lot, calling her brother before she had any idea who he was. The idea of all the things that had to be true at once for that to have happened. She said, He didn't tell you my name? He said a woman named Darlene, Leonard said. With that last name, I had to sit down. Anita thought I was having a spell. They were quiet together. She could hear his breathing and what sounded like a television somewhere in the background, low, and then the sound of it going off. I didn't know what to do, Leonard said. I couldn't call you. I didn't have a right to call you. I thought if it was you and I called, it would come out wrong, and I thought if it wasn't you, it would be worse. So you sent Marcus back. I told him to go back the next Tuesday and find out. A pause. He went back on his own. I didn't have to tell him anything, it turns out. Darlene looked at the wall of her office. There was a photograph of Walter there, taken the day they signed the deed on the diner, both of them squinting into the sun in the parking lot, Walter grinning the way he grinned when he was trying not to look too pleased with himself. They talked for 40 minutes. She told Leonard about Walter dying 3 years ago, about the 2 days she had kept the diner closed and how strange those days had been. The place empty and still, the coffee machine cold. He told her about his second wife, Anita, who she had never met, and about the 2 daughters younger than Marcus who were teenagers now and who Leonard said she would love if she ever met them. And he said it like it was something that could really happen, like it was just a matter of time. Before she hung up, she said, I'm sorry, Leo, for all of it. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Me too, Lena, me too. She sat in her office for a while after the call, not moving. Ray knocked on the door after a few minutes to ask about the dinner prep, and she said she was coming, and she stood up and smoothed her apron and looked at Walter's photograph one more time. All right, she said to it, quietly. She went back out to the counter. She did not know when she walked back out to the lunch counter what the next months would bring in exact detail. She did not know how fast the distance would close or how many Sunday dinners it would take before it felt easy and natural, before Leonard's girls called her Aunt Darlene like it had always been her title. She didn't know that Leonard would drive up from Claremont the following month with Anita and the girls and a casserole dish, and that they would sit around the big table in the back room of the diner after hours with the lights warm overhead and eat and talk until nearly midnight. She only knew what she knew right then, which was that her nephew had walked through her door 7 days ago and the world had shifted on its axis so quietly that no one had even noticed. And the thing that had shifted it was nothing more complicated than a plate of meatloaf and a refusal to take a young man's money. The weeks that followed carried their own small revelations. Marcus came back the next Tuesday too, and the one after that. He was stationed 40 minutes away and had 3 weeks left of stateside time before his next assignment, and he used Tuesday mornings the way some people use church, quietly and with intention. He sat at the near stool now, the one by the door, which Darlene began to think of as his stool, and he drank his coffee and sometimes helped Cynthia refill the water glasses without being asked, which Cynthia appreciated more than she said. Cynthia had worked for Darlene for 7 years and was the sort of woman who noticed everything and commented on very little, which made her an ideal waitress and an ideal observer of human nature. After Marcus's third visit, she came round the counter during a quiet stretch and refilled her own coffee and said, without looking up, "He's got your eyes." Darlene said, "He's my nephew." Cynthia said, "I know," and went back to wiping down the booth by the window, and that was the entire conversation, which was about as much as either of them needed it to be. He told Darlene things about himself in the way people tell you things when they are comfortable with the silence between sentences. He had joined at 19. He had been in 2 deployments, one to the Middle East, and one that he described briefly and without detail, and Darlene did not press. He was thinking about staying in or thinking about coming home. He had not decided. And the deciding felt heavy in a way he was still learning to carry. Darlene listened. She had learned over 11 years that a diner counter is a particular kind of confessional, the kind where nobody is keeping score. She told him things too. She told him about Walter, how he had been her high school sweetheart and her business partner, and her best argument for optimism about human nature, and how 3 years without him had not gotten easier exactly, only more familiar, the way a scar becomes part of the landscape. She told him about buying the diner, about the year the boiler died in January and she'd kept the place open anyway with space heaters borrowed from the hardware store down the block, and how the regulars had brought extra coats and nobody missed a meal. She told him about the apple pie, which Walter had taught her from his grandmother's recipe, how the key was the Cortland apples because they held their shape, and the brown sugar against the lemon, and the particular way of crimping the crust that she had never managed to get exactly right but had long since decided was close enough. He listened the same way she did. Like it mattered. Like he had the time. The 3rd Tuesday he came in, he brought a man with him, a tall man in a suit who introduced himself as Colonel Harris, Marcus's commanding officer. The colonel shook Darlene's hand with both of his and said that Marcus had told him about her policy and he wanted to thank her personally. Darlene said she didn't need thanks, she just had rules. The colonel said he respected that, and he sat down and ordered the meatloaf plate and ate every bite. And before he left, he asked if the Sun-Up Diner would be willing to be listed as a certified military-friendly establishment in the regional directory the base maintained, which was distributed to every service member reporting to the installation. Darlene thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. "Tell me what I need to do," she said. The listing went up in the directory the following month. It was a small thing, 2 lines and a phone number, but the line of small things that followed it was not small. A reporter from the county paper came out and wrote a piece after someone called in the tip. And the piece ran on a Wednesday with a picture of Darlene standing behind the counter holding a coffee pot. And it said her diner had been quietly honouring military members for years and had recently played an unexpected role in reuniting an estranged family. Darlene had not told anyone about the family part and suspected Marcus had, and when she called him to say so, he laughed and did not deny it. The piece got picked up by the regional newswire. By the following week, Darlene was fielding calls from people as far as 3 counties away who had read it, and her Tuesday rush was no longer the only rush with a military character to it. She hired a second full-time cook and trained him herself over 2 weeks and told him her one rule about service members before she told him anything else. She told him the same thing she told everyone who worked in her kitchen. You feed people because they are hungry and because it is right. Everything else follows from that. Leonard drove up on the last Saturday in October, the weekend before Marcus's next assignment took him back overseas. He brought Anita and the girls, as promised. The diner was closed for the evening, which was the first time in 11 years it had been closed for anything other than Christmas, and the 2 days after Walter died. Darlene had cooked. Not diner food, but home food. The kind that takes most of a day and fills a room with the smell of it before anyone sits down. She had made a brisket and sweet potatoes, and Leonard's favourite, her mother's cornbread recipe, which was different from the diner cornbread. Sweeter and higher, more like cake. She had made 2 apple pies. They sat around the big table in the back room. All of them. Darlene and Leonard and Anita and the girls and Marcus. And the light was warm and the room was full of talking. And at some point during the meal, Leonard's younger daughter, who was 13 and had her grandfather's serious eyes, looked at Darlene and asked, "Did you really not know he was your nephew when you gave him the free food?" Darlene said, "I did not." The girl thought about that. "That's the best part," she said. Leonard's older daughter, who was 16 and had been watching Darlene all evening with quiet assessment, said, "Did you not recognize him from pictures?" "We didn't have pictures of each other," Darlene said. "We hadn't spoken in a long time." The girl looked at her father. Leonard looked at his plate. "How long?" the younger one asked. "Keisha," Anita said. "It's all right," Darlene said. 17 years. Keisha considered this with the frank arithmetic of a 13-year-old. "That's longer than I've been alive." "It is," Darlene said. "That's a long time to not talk to somebody." "It is," Darlene said again. There was a small silence, and then Marcus said, "Keisha, you want more pie?" And Keisha said yes, and the conversation moved where conversations at family tables move, toward dessert and easier ground. Darlene looked at Leonard across the table, and Leonard looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, but there was something in the look that was the whole 17 years compressed into one held moment, the waste of it and the grace of what had come out of the other side. After dinner, when the girls were helping Anita with the dishes and Marcus had stepped outside to make a call, Darlene and Leonard sat alone in the back room with the last of the pie and 2 cups of coffee, and the quiet between them was an old quiet, the kind that belongs to people who grew up in the same house and have not forgotten the language of each other's silences. "I've missed you," Leonard said. It was simple and plain, and it cost him something to say it. She could hear that. "I've missed you every day," she said. He nodded. He looked down at his pie. He said, "She would have hated this, Mama. All those years lost. She would have marched us both to the car and driven us to each other's houses," Darlene said. Leonard laughed, and it was the laugh she remembered, low and a little reluctant, the laugh that always came out when something was too true to fight. Marcus left on a Thursday 2 weeks later. He came by the diner on the Tuesday before he shipped out and sat at his stool and drank his coffee and ate his pie. And when he stood up and reached for his duffel bag, he said, "Thank you, Aunt Darlene." And she felt the title land in her chest like a stone into still water, wide and deep and circling outward. She did not get dramatic about it. She refilled his coffee one more time, even though he was leaving, and she told him to be careful and to write when he could, and she watched him push through the door and into the grey November morning. She stood at the window and watched him until his truck was out of sight. The Sun-Up Diner stayed busy through the winter. The military listing kept bringing new faces, and the county article lived on the newspaper's website, and people mentioned it, and Darlene kept her rule and kept her Tuesday pies, and kept Ray and Cynthia and the new cook, whose name was Percy, and who turned out to have a gift for biscuits that made Darlene genuinely reconsider everything she thought she knew about biscuits. She talked to Leonard every Sunday. That was the arrangement they made, a Sunday call, 8 o'clock after he got home from church. It was not a perfect arrangement. Sometimes it was brief, and sometimes it went long, and sometimes they talked about their mother or their father, and those conversations had a particular kind of weight that was part grief and part reckoning, and they didn't always know how to carry it cleanly. They were learning. 2 people who had been strangers for 17 years by choice are not unstrangers in a week. It is slower and more uncertain than that, and more worth doing. By spring, Marcus wrote from overseas. He was well, he said. He had told people about the pie. The letter made Darlene laugh out loud, alone in her office with the door closed, and she taped it to the inside of the cabinet above her desk where she kept the things that mattered. In March, she drove to Claremont for the first time in nearly 20 years. She drove the 2 hours with the radio on, and the windows cracked, and she pulled up in front of Leonard's house, a white clapboard place with a green door and a magnolia tree in the front yard that was just beginning to think about blooming. And Leonard came out onto the porch before she had even turned off the engine, and his wife came behind him, and the 2 girls came out of the house barefoot, despite the cold, because they had heard the car and did not want to wait for the door to be knocked on properly. She stayed 2 nights. The first night they stayed up too late at Leonard's kitchen table, Darlene and Leonard and Anita, while the girls slept, and they talked the way you talk when you have 17 years of ordinary life to cover. The easy things and the hard things mixed together, the way it works when people are trying to remember how to be family to each other. Anita was quieter than Darlene expected, with a steady, warm quality about her, a woman who listened before she spoke and who clearly had loved Leonard well for a long time. Darlene liked her immediately and told her so, which made Anita smile and Leonard pretend he was not pleased. The second morning, Leonard took her for a drive down the old roads, past the house they had grown up in, which had 2 cars in the driveway now and a basketball hoop at the edge of the street where the old dogwood used to be. He stopped the car in front of it, and they both looked at it for a while without saying anything. "I keep thinking she can see us," Leonard said finally. "She can," Darlene said. "She's furious." He laughed and put the car in drive, and they went to get breakfast at a place Leonard liked, and Darlene ordered coffee and did not offer any notes on how it compared to hers, which took some restraint. It was a start, and a start was what the last 7 months had been. One quiet thing building on the next, kindness compounding the way water wears stone, not in a single blow, but in the long, patient arithmetic of return and return and return. Some kindnesses announce themselves. They come with witnesses and photographs and words spoken into microphones. Darlene had never wanted that. She had her rules, and she kept them, and she asked nothing back from the people she fed, and she had not kept score across 11 years of refusals at the register. The score had been kept without her. That is the thing about an ordinary Tuesday, an ordinary plate of food, an ordinary word of comfort given to a tired young man at the end of a long road. You do not know what it is carrying. You do not know whose name is on it. You do not know what door it is opening on the other side of 17 years of silence. You only know what she knew, which is that the right thing to do is not complicated even when it is costly, and that a person who feeds the hungry because they are hungry and because it is right has already made the only calculation that matters. The magnolia in Leonard's yard bloomed in April. He sent her a picture. She put it on the wall of her office next to the cabinet with the letter from Marcus, and she went out to the counter and started the coffee and waited for her people to come in. Have you ever given something away without knowing what you were really giving? Leave a note in the comments, because there is more goodness in this world than we remember to count. And if a story like this one is what you needed today, stay close, because there are more where it came from. The next Tuesday, the stool by the door was empty. She left it that way until Wednesday. Then a woman in scrubs came in, sitting heavily after a long night shift, and Darlene set a coffee in front of her without asking, and the woman looked up with the specific gratitude of someone who needed that coffee more than they could say, and Darlene picked up her order pad, and the whole quiet business started over again. It always does, in a diner like hers. That is the only miracle she had ever needed.